Deep inside a cave system in South Africa, so narrow that only the smallest scientists on Earth could fit through it, researchers found something that shouldn't exist. Bones. Dozens of them, scattered through a chamber that no sunlight has touched in millions of years, belonging to a creature with a brain barely bigger than a chimpanzee's. And those bones were not scattered there by accident. They may have been carried in, one body at a time, and placed there on purpose by others of its own kind. If that's true, it means a species we assumed was too primitive to think about death may have understood something we believed only humans could understand. To reach those bones, a scientist has to lie flat, exhale, and squeeze sideways through a gap barely 8 inches wide, in total darkness, hundreds of feet underground. Why would anyone or anything go through that just to leave a body behind? That question is now one of the most contested debates in the entire study of human origins. For more than 100 years, paleoanthropologists believed one rule was almost sacred. Understanding death requires a big brain. You need self-awareness. You need memory that stretches into the past and imagination that stretches into the future. You need the ability to picture a world tomorrow that no longer includes someone who was there yesterday. Modern humans carry a brain of about 1,350 cubic centimeters. That's the brain that lets us hold funerals, write eulogies, build tombs, and ask in quiet moments what happens after we die. But the creature found in that South African cave had a brain of only 460 to 610 cubic centimeters. That's barely larger than a chimpanzee's brain, roughly a third the size of yours, and small enough that for decades, scientists assumed a creature like this couldn't plan much further ahead than its next meal. So here's the question splitting the scientific world in two. How could a brain that small organize something as complex as returning again and again to bury the dead? Was this really a form of ritual, or is there a far simpler explanation that has nothing to do with grief, memory, or meaning at all? And if this species really did understand death, what does that say about the story we've been telling ourselves about what makes humans unique? Because if it's true, then the roots of one of humanity's most sacred behaviors don't start with us. They start with something small, ancient, and easy to underestimate. To understand this mystery, picture Earth roughly 300,000 years ago. Homo sapiens, our own species, had only just appeared in Africa, but we were far from alone. Several other kinds of humans were walking the same continent, hunting the same land, drinking from the same rivers. One of them was small. Adult males stood around 5 feet tall and likely weighed less than 100 pounds. Their shoulders and curved fingers were built for climbing, almost ape-like, but their wrists and hands were precise enough for fine tool use, closer to ours. Their legs and feet were adapted for long-distance walking, much like a modern human's. It was a strange mix, part ancient, part familiar. Scientists named this species Homo naledi, after the cave system where it was discovered, Rising Star, located in the cradle of humankind just northwest of Johannesburg, South Africa. In the local Sesotho language, Naledi means star. The discovery happened almost by accident. In 2013, two recreational cavers exploring Rising Star squeezed through a narrow crack and dropped into a chamber they'd never seen before. Scattered across the floor were bones, not a few, dozens. They photographed what they saw and sent the images to paleoanthropologist Lee Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand. Berger immediately recognized the shape of the skull fragments, hominin, human family, but the passage leading to the chamber was so narrow, so twisted, that Berger himself, a grown man in his late 40s, could not fit through it. So he did something almost unheard of in science. He posted a public call for help, specifically requesting excavators who were small, slim, and unafraid of extremely tight spaces. Cavers, climbers, scientists barely 5 feet tall with narrow shoulders. 6 women answered the call. The media later nicknamed them the underground astronauts, because the environment they entered was, in some ways, as hostile and alien as space. They descended through a vertical chute so narrow in places that it's been compared to squeezing through a mail slot. Then they crawled, climbed, and wriggled nearly 100 feet below the surface, through total darkness, to reach a chamber now known as Dinaledi. At first, nobody thought this discovery would be especially controversial. A new hominin species, a small brain, an oddly ancient-looking skeleton mixed with some surprisingly modern features, interesting but not explosive. Then researchers started asking exactly how those bones ended up in that particular chamber. That question would not have a simple answer. The problem of location. The first clue that something unusual was happening came from geography, not biology. The Dinaledi chamber isn't near the cave entrance. It isn't an open space where animals could easily wander in, get trapped, and die. the way caves have claimed countless creatures for millions of years. It sits at the end of an extremely narrow, difficult, multi-stage passage. To reach it today, a person has to descend a vertical shaft, cross a jagged section nicknamed the Dragon's Back, and then squeeze through a passage so tight in places that it's often described as the most challenging part of the entire journey. No natural light reaches that far into the system. Not one photon at any time of day in any season. That created an immediate scientific problem. How did the bones get there? At first, the simplest explanation seemed obvious. Maybe unlucky individuals wandered too far into the dark, became disoriented, and fell to their deaths, or simply couldn't find their way back out. Caves are notorious death traps. Animals have fallen into them and starved or drowned or broken bones on jagged rock for as long as caves have existed. But then the excavation team found something that broke that simple explanation apart. They uncovered the remains of at least 15 different individuals, ranging from infants to adults, deposited across what appeared to be multiple separate episodes rather than a single event. Some bones showed signs of having been placed relatively gently. There was no sign of large-scale trauma consistent with a fatal fall, no crushed skulls or shattered limbs typical of creatures plunging through a shaft, and there was no evidence that predators had dragged the bodies there. No tooth marks from hyenas or leopards, no scattering patterns typical of scavenger activity, no bones from other animals mixed in the way you'd expect if this had simply been a den or a trap that caught multiple species over time. Whatever happened here seemed to involve almost exclusively Homo naledi, deposited repeatedly in one of the most difficult-to-reach spaces in the entire cave system, the fire discovery. If bodies were carried into a chamber with absolutely no natural light, the individuals doing the carrying needed a way to see. This is where researchers made their next major discovery. Excavators found small hearths, charred wood fragments, and sooty residue on the walls and ceilings of chambers near Dinaledi, deep within the cave system, far from the entrance. Radiocarbon dating and other techniques suggested these fire traces were consistent in age with the Homo naledi remains. This single detail reshaped the entire debate. Getting lost and dying in an unfamiliar cave is a tragic accident. Repeatedly navigating a treacherous, pitch-black passage while carrying fire, generation after generation, to reach the exact same remote chamber is not an accident. That takes memory. It takes planning. It takes the ability to teach others the route, because a single individual living roughly into their 20s or 30s, the estimated lifespan of Homo naledi, would not have been enough to sustain this behavior across the time span the fossils suggest. That means knowledge of this ritual, if that's what it was, had to be passed down, shown to someone, learned. For a species with a brain a third the size of ours, that is a genuinely staggering behavioral claim. The deliberate burial claim. In 2023, Berger's team escalated the story further. They published a set of papers, later expanded into a book and documentary, claiming they had identified something even more specific than fire and repeated deposits. They described shallow, oval-shaped depressions in the cave floor containing partial skeletons, arranged in ways they argued were consistent with deliberate burial rather than natural accumulation. In one case, they reported a body appearing to have been placed in a flexed, curled position, a posture seen in many later human burials around the world. They also pointed to markings on nearby cave walls, described as engraved geometric patterns, including crosshatched lines and shapes. If genuine and made intentionally by Homo naledi, these would be among the oldest known engravings ever attributed to any hominin species, older than anything created by big-brained modern humans. Berger's team went even further, suggesting these engravings might represent the earliest known form of symbolic mark-making, something previously associated only with the far larger brains of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and only from a much later period. If every part of this interpretation holds up, the implications would be enormous. This wasn't a large-brained, complex tool-making human. This was a small-bodied, small-brained hominin, potentially performing funeral behavior and symbolic art, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of years before anyone thought such behavior was possible. Naturally, a claim this large did not sail through the scientific community quietly. Here is where the story becomes genuinely uncertain, and where an honest documentary has to slow down. Not every paleoanthropologist accepts the burial interpretation, and the disagreement isn't a fringe objection. It comes from respected researchers across multiple institutions. When Berger's team first submitted their 2023 papers to the open-access journal eLife, the journal published them alongside independent peer reviews, a relatively unusual and transparent process. Several reviewers raised serious concerns. Some argued that what looked like a deliberate burial pit could simply be the result of natural sediment movement. Caves are not static. Water seeps through cracks over hundreds of thousands of years. Fine sediment settles unevenly. Bones can sink, shift, and cluster in ways that mimic an intentional pit without anyone ever digging one. Reviewers also pointed out that the dating of the sediment surrounding the proposed burial pits was not tightly constrained enough to prove the depression and the bones were the same age. A critical requirement for proving deliberate burial rather than a body settling into an already existing depression over time. The claims about engravings faced similar skepticism. Critics noted that the cave walls at Rising Star show natural scratches and fracture patterns from geological processes, and separating a deliberately made mark from a natural one, especially without a securely dated surface, is extremely difficult. eLife's own editorial summary at the time stated that the evidence supporting deliberate burial was, in their assessment, incomplete, and this triggered public back and forth between the journal and Berger's team about how confident the conclusions should be. This is important to say clearly. This isn't a story of bad science or of one side being dishonest. It's science working the way it's supposed to. A team makes a bold claim. Other experts scrutinize it hard. The claim either survives that scrutiny, gets revised, or falls apart. That process can take years, and for Homo naledi, it is still ongoing. So where does that leave the actual mystery? Here's what nearly everyone in the field agrees on. Even the harshest critics. Homo naledi remains are, for reasons still not fully explained, unusually concentrated deep inside one of the most difficult-to-reach chambers in an enormous cave system. That clustering is real and it isn't seriously disputed. Fire residue really has been found deep in these passages, far from where sunlight reaches. Predator activity, the most common natural explanation for bones ending up in caves, doesn't match the evidence here. What remains genuinely unresolved is the interpretation of why. Was this intentional burial similar in spirit to what we associate with big-brained modern humans? Was it a less formal but still repeated behavior, something like a customary place to leave the dead, without pits, postures, or symbolic meaning attached? Or is there some entirely different explanation researchers haven't identified yet? The honest answer, as of the most recent published research, is that nobody knows for certain. This remains one of the most actively debated questions in modern paleoanthropology, and new excavation seasons at Rising Star continue to add data almost every year. So, how did a brain the size of a chimpanzee's come to understand death? The most accurate answer available right now is this. We don't know for certain whether Homo naledi understood death in the emotional, symbolic way modern humans do. But the physical evidence strongly suggests this species treated its dead very differently from the way any known non-human animal treats a body. That distinction matters more than it might first seem. You don't need a massive brain to notice that something has changed when a member of your group stops moving, stops responding, and begins to decay. Nature already shows us plenty of examples of animals reacting to death in ways that go beyond simple indifference. Elephants are famous for investigating the bones of dead herd members, sometimes touching skulls and tusks with their trunks in what researchers describe as unusually careful, deliberate movements, returning to the same remains on separate occasions. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have been observed sitting quietly beside the bodies of dead group members for extended periods, sometimes gently touching or grooming the body, sometimes appearing agitated or subdued. Behavior researchers hesitate to label as grief but struggle to fully explain any other way. Crows and other corvids have been documented gathering around their dead in what some scientists call funerals, likely as a way of assessing danger in the environment, though the emotional experience behind it remains unknown. None of these behaviors involve carrying a body through darkness, using fire to navigate, and depositing it in a specific, difficult-to-reach location, over and over, across what may be generations. If the burial hypothesis at Rising Star holds up under continued scrutiny, it would place Homo naledi in an entirely different category. Not simple reaction to a dead body in the moment, but repeated, planned, transmitted behavior. For comparison, it helps to look at what we're more confident about elsewhere in the human family tree. At Cima de los Huesos in Spain, a site dated to roughly 430,000 years ago, researchers found the remains of at least 28 individuals belonging to an ancestor of Neanderthals, deep within a cave system, alongside a single, finely made stone hand axe that showed no signs of use. Some researchers argue this represents one of the earliest examples of possible symbolic behavior connected to death, though, just like Rising Star, this interpretation is debated. Neanderthals themselves, with brains roughly the same size as ours or slightly larger, have far stronger and more widely accepted evidence of burial. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal skeleton was found alongside clusters of pollen, initially interpreted by some researchers as evidence of flowers placed at burial, though later analysis suggested some of that pollen might have been introduced by burrowing insects rather than intentional decoration. Even with that revision, the surrounding evidence for deliberate Neanderthal burial at multiple sites across Europe and the Middle East remains strong and widely accepted. What makes Homo naledi different, and genuinely startling if the interpretation holds, is that it had a fraction of the brain size of Neanderthals or modern humans, yet may have engaged in comparably deliberate treatment of its dead tens of thousands of years earlier than anyone expected such behavior to appear. If that holds up under continued research, it suggests something quietly profound. The roots of how humans treat their dead may not have started with the arrival of large brains at all. They may have started with something much smaller, much older, and far more widespread across the human family tree than scientists ever expected. Brain size, it turns out, might not be the whole story. Social bonds, memory, and the ability to teach a behavior to the next generation might matter just as much, maybe more, than raw brain volume. For more than a century, scientists searched for the origin of human ritual in the biggest brains our ancestors ever grew, assuming that ceremony, memory, and meaning arrived only alongside massive cognitive expansion. Rising star caves suggest we may have been looking in the wrong place, or at least only telling half the story. A creature with a brain closer in size to a chimpanzee's than to yours may have navigated total darkness, using fire to carry its dead into one of the most inaccessible spaces on the African continent, again and again, possibly across generations. We still don't know exactly why. We don't know if Homo naledi felt anything resembling grief, or whether this behavior had a purpose closer to instinct than emotion. That question may not be fully answered for years, if it ever is. But that uncertainty raises another mystery scientists are only beginning to explore. If a brain this small could possibly do this, what other behaviors we've always assumed required advanced human intelligence might actually be older, simpler, and far more common across the animal kingdom than anyone expected? If you enjoy exploring the biggest questions about history, science, and our world, subscribe to this channel for more documentaries like this one.